Hi, this is Bill Carmody with a review of the chapter on melody. The smallest fragment we have in a musical phrase is called a motif or motive. And a sequence is a repeat of a motif at a different pitch level. So there are two kinds of sequences. A real sequence, which is the top one here, that maintains exact intervals. So between the first and second note of this example, there's a half step. So when we do the sequence, the real sequence, starting in the third measure, between the F and the G flat, we have to go up a half step. The tonal sequence keeps in the same key that the original was in. Here, the first two notes, again, E to F, are a half step. But in the third measure, when we take everything up a step, we stay in the key of C. So F to G is now a whole step. So we modify the intervals to stay in the key. A false sequence or a modified sequence, part of it is sequenced and part of it is not. So in this case, the 6.7, the Beethoven trio, the first note, B flat, is the same both in the original and in the sequence. In the original, the B flat goes up to an E flat, and in the sequence, or the false sequence, it starts on the B flat like a straight repetition and goes up to an F instead. So part of it gets sequenced, the E flat goes up to F, but part of it doesn't. Same thing with the Schubert example, only in this case the first part is sequenced and the second part is not. So the first part, B flat, D, F, F, and the sequence goes down a step, A to C, but then keeps on going on the F. So part of it's sequenced and part of it's not, and that's called a false sequence. A phrase is a complete musical thought. It has a motif in it, but it comes to a logical conclusion, a pause at the end. It's like a sentence in English where you have a period at the end or a question mark. So a period in music takes two phrases or more, and the first phrase, called the antecedent, usually ends in a half cadence, and it has a feeling of a question. It's incomplete. There's a pause there, so it's the end of the phrase, but it's not a complete melody. And then the second phrase, called the consequent, ends with a full cadence, an authentic cadence, and it does sound finished and complete. We have parallel periods where the second phrase starts the same as the first phrase. We have contrasting periods where the second phrase starts differently than the first phrase. And there's also 3 phrase periods and a double period, 4 phrase period. Melodic contour has to do with the arch of the melody in the phrase. It usually builds up to some high point and then comes back down, or sometimes the phrase will go down and then come back up. But usually there's some kind of arch with a climax, and the climax will stand out in some way. It can either be a tonic climax or pitch climax, where the climactic note is the highest note in the phrase or the lowest note in the phrase, but somehow it stands out melodically. An agogic accent or climax is a rhythmic notation. The longer note usually surrounded by shorter notes. In this case of the Beethoven, when we get to the climatic point, the note's not really longer, but it repeats the 3 B flats, and so by repetition that B flat gets held out longer than other notes. And a dynamic climax, which means that it's louder than the surrounding notes. So at some point the music grows, crescendos, and then decrescendos, comes away from it. So those are the 3 types of climaxes: tonic, agogic, and dynamic. So that's pretty much it for this chapter. Make sure that you know how to describe each of these terms that we've learned in this chapter. I didn't talk about phrase extension, where they add a couple of measures either to the beginning, or usually not the beginning, but sometimes the beginning, the middle, or most often at the end of the phrase. So the last two measures of a phrase will repeat or have longer note values or something like that to extend the phrase more than just 4 measures. And the types of periods. So review in the text and along with this. And finally, on the quiz, you'll have a little musical example like this and be asked to finish the example. So write a parallel period, which means that in the third measure it's going to be starting off the same as it does in the first measure, because a parallel period, the first part is the same. A contrasting period means that the third measure is going to be different than the first measure. A tonal sequence goes up or down but stays in the same key. This one looks like it's in the key of C. And a real sequence goes up or down by a step or half step, and it'll maintain the same intervals. So the G to the F sharp, the first 2 notes, it's a half step difference. If you take it up a step to do a real sequence, the first note would be A, and the second note would be G sharp, because it's a half step below the first note. So that's what this chapter is about. Good luck, and if you have any questions, feel free to speak up in class. Bye-bye.